I've always believed in miracles.
And I'm not afraid to crush miracles. This is a bill which Australians cannot afford.
We've got to fight for our rights. Good afternoon, it is Darcy Hint and I'm reporting to you from Looking on the Right Side. Our Australians have got the opportunity to vote for whether a constitutional Bill of Rights will be implemented into Australia. As the votes trickle in, we're going to head over to our studio to learn more.
Thank you, Darcy. Today we're going to look at the Australian Constitution and the rights enshrined in it. Currently, Australia's civil liberties are protected through various common law and political processes, including responsible government and independent judiciary, a transparent executive, and Australia's status as a sovereign nation. Additionally, human rights in Australia are protected by various legal instruments, for example, the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. To dive deeper into Australia's current constitutional framework, I have invited Professor Hayley Jones, a constitutional law expert, to explain express and limited rights. Welcome, Hayley. Firstly, Hayley, what are the rights guaranteed under the Australian Constitution?
Absolutely. The Australian Constitution sets out a number of rights and freedoms that are protected under the law. These include freedom of religion. Under Section 116 of the Constitution, it guarantees that the Commonwealth cannot make any law prohibiting the free exercise of any religion. Right to a fair trial. Under Section 80 of the Constitution, guarantees that anyone accused of a crime has the right to a trial by jury, including a speedy trial and the right to legal representation. Freedom of movement under Section 92 of the Constitution guarantees that businesses can trade between states free and unrestricted. Under Section 51, subsection 31 of the Constitution, there is the right to property, which guarantees that the Commonwealth cannot take property from anyone without providing fair compensation. And finally, there is the right to vote under Section 41 of the Constitution, which guarantees that all citizens of Australia have the right to vote in elections.
Are there any other rights that Australia's people have?
Additionally to this, the High Court can imply rights into the Constitution where necessary.
Can you explain how these rights are protected under Australian law?
Yes. The Constitution is the supreme law of Australia and sets out the framework for our legal system. The High Court of Australia is responsible for interpreting the Constitution, and it has the power to strike down any laws that are inconsistent with it. This means that if any law violates one of the rights protected under the Constitution, it can be challenged and potentially struck down by the court.
Thank you, Hayley, for shining a light on the current rights within Australia. This has been a valuable and informative discussion. Now back to Darcy.
Thank you, Jessie and Professor Jones, for the insight into our constitutional framework. Now we're heading over to Kira, our international law expert, who will provide us with some perspectives on how other jurisdictions have imported the Bill of Rights.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Darcy. On the topic of whether a Bill of Rights should be enshrined into the Australian Constitution, there are many conflating arguments on whether it will protect our rights and freedoms such as the freedom of speech, religion and association. It could also provide greater clarity and certainty in the law. Yet the question of how it would in essence operate in conjunction with our Australian Constitution and the provisions that are currently in place to protect our human rights, what this would look like, how it would affect us, what provisions would it provide, is it necessary? In answering these practical questions, we must look to other countries and how they've implemented Bill of Rights within their constitutions. Currently, Australia is the only Western country that has not adopted a Bill of Rights. A quintessential and well-recognised example of a Bill of Rights is the United States. The United States Bill of Rights is a document that outlines a set of fundamental rights and freedoms that are protected under the US Constitution. This was ratified in 1791 and consists of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights guarantees a range of individual liberties, including the freedom of speech, religion, and the press. This within the framework of the Constitution by setting out limitations on government power and by outlining individual rights and freedoms that the government must protect. For example, the First Amendment within the Bill of Rights protects the right to freedom and religion. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Bill of Rights also operates in conjunction with other constitutional provisions, such as the Commerce Clause and the Due Process Clause. The Commerce Clause, for example, gives the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. with the Due Process Clause guarantees certain procedural protections for individuals accused of crimes. The Bill of Rights is interpreted and enforced by the US Supreme Court and other federal and state courts. However, the Bill of Rights in the United States has been subject to ongoing criticism and debate, with critics arguing that it is insufficiently protecting certain rights and overly protective of individual liberties, inflexible and limited in scope. Another country that has a Bill of Rights is Canada. Canada's Bill of Rights is a federal statute that was passed by the Canadian government in 1960. The document outlines a range of fundamental rights and freedoms that are protected under the Canadian law, including the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a right to a fair trial. While the Canadian Bill of Rights is an important piece of legislation, it is not considered part of the Canadian Constitution. Instead, it is seen as a precursor to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was added to the Constitution in 1982. In contrast to the Canadian Bill of Rights, which was a federal statute, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is enshrined in the Constitution and is therefore considered to be a higher source of law. This means that any law or actions by government officials that are inconsistent with the Charter of Rights can be challenged in court and struck down if found unconstitutional. The effect of giving more weight to the Charter of Rights is that while both types of documents outline fundamental rights and freedoms, the Charter is broader in scope and covers a wider range of rights and freedoms, including social and economic rights. The Charter also includes a series outlining the rights of Canada's Indigenous population, which is a unique feature among constitutional documents. While the Canadian Bill of Rights was an important precursor to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it is not considered a part of the Constitution and therefore is seen as having less legal weight. This is Kira Erickson from the International Constitution Committee for Looking from the Right Side.
So what would the process be of adding a Bill of Rights into the Australian framework?
Well, there are two ways a Bill of Rights could be implemented in Australia. The first is through a statute, which is a law passed by Parliament. This would involve the Parliament passing a new law that would outline the specific rights and freedoms that are protected. The second option would be to add a Bill of Rights into the Australian Constitution.
Can you explain how adding a Bill of Rights to the Australian Constitution would work?
Adding a Bill of Rights to the Australian Constitution would develop a new chapter in the document, thus expanding express rights protection for civil liberties.
So what are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach?
The advantage of enshrining a Bill of Rights in statute is that it is quicker and more flexible. It allows for incremental changes to be made over time and provides a framework for the courts to interpret and enforce those rights. The disadvantage is that it can be amended or repealed by any government with a simple majority in Parliament. The advantage of amending the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights is that it would be much harder to amend or appeal, ensuring that our rights and freedoms are protected over the long term. The disadvantage is that it is a difficult and time-consuming process, and it may be difficult to achieve a consensus on what rights and freedoms should be included.
Thank you, Hayley. Back to you, Darcy.
Thank you, Jessie and Professor Jones, for your time. Before we head into our discussion panel, we're going to head out to the public to see what they know about the Australian Bill of Rights. Do we have a constitution in this country?
I don't know because I don't know what a constitution is.
Yes.
I think we do, yeah.
How many rights do you think are protected under the Constitution?
7.
What rights do you think are under the Constitution?
I'm not sure.
The right to water.
Can you list a right that is listed under the Constitution?
No.
Do you know what rights you have that are protected under the Constitution?
Citizenship rights.
Can you list all or any of those?
The right to vote.
Do you think we have a Bill of Rights in this country?
I assume we would, yes. Like, I'm assuming there's laws in place to protect our rights, yes.
Do you think we have a Bill of Rights?
I don't think so.
Do you believe in a Bill of Rights in Australia?
Yes.
Should Australia have a Bill of Rights?
Yes.
Yeah, why not?
What rights do you think should exist in Australia?
The right for free tampons.
We should be allowed to smoke weed.
Okay.
Like the right to be paid for work.
I think we should have 4-day working weeks.
Off the top of my head, access to healthcare.
Free speech.
We do have rights protected under the Constitution. We've only got about 4, which is the right to protection from acquisition of property, the right to freedom of religion, right to trial by jury, and the right to not be discriminated based on the state that you live in. So very technical rights. The High Court has found implied rights such as freedom of political communication, but the government can restrict your rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights. And the answer to the question is, should there be a Bill of Rights, is entirely up to you. So, yeah.
Welcome back to the discussion panel. Amidst the referendum campaign, we have brought in two opposing minds. On my left, I have the Honourable Oliver Griffiths, who is the chairman of the Constitutional Conservation Movement. On my right, I have the more Honourable Olivia Green, who is the director of the Civil Liberties Movement. Thank you for being here. Ms Green, your campaign supports the implementation of the Bill of Rights in the Australian Constitution. Can you explain further on this?
Thank you, Darcy. That's a really good question. I think that what we need to remember and acknowledge is that the Constitution as a document was first created in 1901. So that document has endured over 100 years, and since that time, only 8 out of 44 referendums have been successful. So I think that what's underpinning my campaign is this lack of flexibility, this lack of social progress that we've seen, because we've still got the same laws that we had in 1901 in a new, modern, multicultural society where we have people from all different demographics, from all different countries who need better rights protection. But I think that what we need to recognise is this diminishing faith because government isn't as representative as we may think it is. We also need to recognise that Australia is one of the only major Anglophone countries that do not have a Bill of Rights. So in terms of our international standing, we are behind everyone else. And this is something that Chief Justice Spiegelman warned us, that if we don't bring ourselves in line with the international community, we will face a degree of intellectual isolation. If we were to bring in a Bill of Rights, we would be able to promise that individual liberties would be protected, whether that's through a constitutionally entrenched chapter or whether that's through a legislative bill through the arms of Parliament.
Wow, Ms Green presents some very compelling points in favour of the Bill of Rights in Australia. Mr Griffiths, do you agree with what Ms Green was just saying?
No, I don't, frankly. And look, the fact of the matter is, Ms Green has brought up 3 key concepts as to why we supposedly need this change. The first is that the Constitution isn't changed enough. The second is that the status quo somehow is not working. And the third is that we should just follow the crowd. Now look, these are sentiments I profoundly disagree with, and I think actually undermines Australia's constitutional framework for the worse. If we start with the argument that we need to update and change the Constitution every time it's hip and cool, that's not how it works. The Constitution is a solid document that is there to be the rule of law, the law of the land. We have a document that changes when it is necessary to do so, and a Bill of Rights is not necessary whatsoever. But the second point she makes is that the current governing structures of this nation do not protect the fundamental rights of humans. Now look, all I have to say is 3 words: Potter and Minahan. That is the presumption that the courts have imposed that Parliament, at face value, does not intend to undermine fundamental rights in this country. Look at what Leask says. The case of Leask says if the government does something acting under their legislative powers, it must be proportional to what they can do. Now, even if it's not specific things that are in the Constitution, they've also got nationwide news, which says that based on the structures of responsible government, a structure which I profoundly believe in, because of this structure, you've got responsible government and you've also got the separation of powers. From this fundamental construction of how our nation operates, it creates an implied right to things like political communication. These are things that the Mason Court discussed, one of the most progressive courts in history. So you've had the argument that the Constitution isn't changed enough. It's not there to be chopped and changed. You've also got the argument that it doesn't adequately protect people, which is in fact wrong. But the third point is that we need to follow the crowd. She brings up the fact that we're one of the only Western nations without a codified Bill of Rights. But I don't know why we need one. Just because other people are doing it doesn't make it the right thing to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffiths.
Ms. Green, do you have a response to these propositions?
I absolutely do. So, Mr. Griffiths brought up the point that just because we have a constitution, it should never be changed. That it not changing is reflective of its effectiveness. And I would actually like to completely reject that argument. I think that if people in Australia were more aware of what is and what is not in the constitution, this would be a clear-cut majority vote for yes. Because simply, just because, and I can appreciate that in terms of democracy, a constitution is necessary. It has to endure to an extent. I think that the fact that this constitution has endured for over 120 years, which in that time has seen a massive shift in legal, political, social landscapes, is simply unacceptable. I think that Mr. Griffiths is in a position of privilege if he can just sit there and say that this constitution protects all of his rights. Because frankly, I think that if you went out into the public and spoke to people from minority and marginalised demographics, they would say, we don't have any rights. And you can start looking at that with First Nations people and the upcoming referendum that follows this one regarding the voice to Parliament, because that is something that we don't have. We don't have enough diversity in our constitution. We don't have enough ways to help people who are in positions more disadvantaged than us. And Mr. Griffiths can't appreciate that viewpoint because he's the one in the position of advantage. I am also in a position of advantage as a white, middle-class Australian woman, but I can see where the flaws are and how this system doesn't cater to everyone.
The fact of the matter is, if you want something that is reflective and more accurately reflective of society, you look towards Parliament. If you don't, go to the High Court.
Circling back to the matter of international trends, Mr. Griffiths, you pointed out that Ms. Green was in favour of following international trends of adopting a constitutional Bill of Rights.
I did.
Ms. Green, can you comment further on this?
Yes, I think that the way in which Mr. Griffiths approached what I put forward overlooked the fact that international trends and international standards are a useful tool for us as a nation to reflect on, to analyse and to evaluate what other countries are doing and what precautions, what safeguards they've put up to ensure that the citizens within their sovereign state are kept safe to the best of the government's capacity. What I am advocating for is not reflective of, well, just because New Zealand's done this, we have to do this. That's not the case. And I look into it in an objective way and I see that the way that they have imported a Bill of Rights and the human rights protection that have followed since that point has been successful. It hasn't disrupted democracy at all. It has fit quite well into the constitutional framework. And I think, well, in Australia, we have a few human rights issues. Predominantly First Nations people not having the recognition that they need within our country. And I look to those nations and I think, well, why don't we do what they've done? It's as simple as that. These countries are successful democratic nations, so Mr. Griffiths' feel about that, how that would ruin democracy, that it's simply not true.
Ms. Green, what would you like to say to the voters at home?
Look, if you're at home and you're not sure on what way you want to go, what I would recommend is that you look up the Constitution, you read through it, and I can guarantee you that when you read through that document, you will see where information that must be included is simply just not there. So please, vote yes for progress.
Thank you, Ms. Green. And Mr. Griffith, any final remarks from you?
I'm going to remark a great man of thought, Sir Robert Menzies, who once said that to define rights is to either limit or to express them so broadly that governing is impossible. If you really don't know, then vote no. It's scary and I don't want that in this country. This is a bill we cannot afford.
Well, that is all we have time for today. The results are in. It was a 50-50 split. The final decision is up to you. This is Darcy Hinz from Looking on the Right Side, signing off.
Authorised by Looking on the Right Side Australia.